There's a strange kind of silence that only appears after your understanding of the world begins to change. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence that comes before someone speaks. I mean the silence that settles inside you when the explanations you've relied on your entire life suddenly stop fitting. Nothing dramatic happens. The world looks exactly the same. People wake up, answer messages, laugh at familiar jokes, repeat familiar routines. Everything continues as if nothing has shifted. But somewhere beneath all of that, something has. And once you notice it, you can never return to the version of yourself that didn't. Most people spend their lives believing certainty is something they collect. One answer becomes another. One achievement replaces the last. One relationship convinces them they've finally arrived somewhere permanent. But permanence is one of the greatest illusions we ever create, not because nothing lasts, because everything changes long before we're willing to admit it has. I've watched people cling to identities they secretly outgrew years ago. I've watched conversations continue long after both people stopped saying what they actually meant. I've watched smiles become habits instead of emotions. And the unsettling part, almost nobody notices, because people don't fear change itself. They fear becoming aware of it. Awareness asks for something that comfort never does. It asks you to respond, to acknowledge, to choose. Ignoring reality is often easier than reorganizing your entire understanding around it. That's why most people never really look. They glance, they assume. They translate everything through expectations they've carried for years. It saves energy, it protects certainty. But certainty has never interested me. Accuracy has. Those two things sound similar until life forces you to choose between them. Certainty says you've already found the answer. Accuracy keeps asking better questions. And questions, real questions, have a way of dismantling the person who asked them. I've always wondered why people rush toward conclusions. Maybe because conclusions feel like home. They close doors, they reduce possibilities, they transform uncertainty into something manageable. But life rarely respects conclusions. It quietly grows beyond them while we're busy defending them. I've seen it happen too many times. Someone says they'll never forgive until they do. Someone promises they'll never leave until they can't stay. Someone insists they've figured themselves out until one unexpected moment introduces them to a version of themselves they've never met before. Identity isn't built once. It's negotiated constantly. Most people simply don't notice the negotiations happening beneath their own awareness. That's what fascinates me, not behavior, the machinery behind behavior. The invisible conversations every mind has with itself before a single word reaches the outside world. Because every action begins somewhere no one else can see. Every decision exists as thought before it becomes movement. Every transformation starts long before anyone recognizes that it's happening. People celebrate the visible moment. I pay attention to the invisible one, the moment before certainty, the moment before surrender, the moment before someone finally admits a truth they've been carefully avoiding. Those moments reveal more than years of ordinary conversation ever could. Maybe that's why I've always felt slightly disconnected from ordinary interactions. Not because I dislike people, but because most conversations stop exactly where they become interesting. Someone says they're fine. No one asks what fine actually means. Someone laughs. Everyone assumes happiness. Someone disappears. People call it distance instead of wondering what finally became too heavy to carry. Survey is efficient. Diff is expensive. It costs attention, it costs patience, it costs the willingness to discover something that might permanently change the way you see another person. Most aren't willing to pay that price. And honestly, I understand why seeing clearly comes with responsibility. Once you understand someone accurately, you lose the luxury of judging them carelessly. That makes life much more complicated because simplicity often depends on misunderstanding. It's easier to categorize people than to comprehend them. It's easier to reduce someone to a single mistake than to examine the thousands of invisible experiences that quietly shaped it. Nuance demands effort, labels don't. Maybe that's why the world prefers certainty over truth. Truth keeps changing as understanding grows. Certainty refuses to move. For a long time, I thought remaining detached protected me from that conflict. Observation felt safer than participation. Watching instead of becoming involved. Understanding without belonging. It seemed like the most logical way to exist. Distance creates perspective. Perspective creates clarity. Or at least, that's what I convinced myself. But perspective has limits. You can study the ocean forever from the shore. You'll learn about waves, about tides, about movement. But you'll never understand water until it surrounds you. There are experiences that cannot be analyzed from outside themselves. Cockench is one of them. You can explain attachment. You can define trust. You can describe vulnerability with remarkable precision. None of it compares to actually standing inside those experiences when they're happening. Theory dissolves quickly in the presence of reality. That realization unsettled me more than I expected because it meant understanding wasn't enough anymore. At some point, life asks whether you're willing to experience what you've spent years explaining, and those are completely different things. Knowledge is controlled. Experience isn't. Experience interrupts your theories. It refuses to follow the neat structures you've built to organize reality. It introduces exceptions, contradictions, questions you never considered because they couldn't exist until they happened to you. That's the danger of genuine experience. It rewrites you from the inside, not dramatically, quietly, one realization at a time, until one day you notice your internal landscape no longer resembles the one you spent years carefully constructing. Nothing announces the transformation. There's no ceremony, no obvious beginning, just small adjustments accumulating beneath awareness, like rivers reshaping stone. Too slowly to witness in a single moment, impossible to ignore once enough time has passed. I've started wondering whether that's how every meaningful change happens. Not through impact, through repetition. One thought revisited often enough becomes belief. One belief practiced long enough becomes identity. One identity protected long enough becomes a prison. And prisons rarely look like cages. Sometimes they look like certainty. Sometimes they look like comfort. Sometimes they look exactly like the person you've convinced yourself you'll always be. That's what makes them difficult to escape. You don't recognize walls you've mistaken for home. I think that's why genuine freedom feels uncomfortable at first. It removes familiar limits. Without limits, possibility becomes overwhelming. Choice becomes responsibility. Responsibility becomes impossible to avoid. People often ask for freedom. Very few ask for everything freedom requires. Because once nothing is stopping you, you can no longer blame the walls. You have to confront yourself. And that's a conversation most people postpone for an entire lifetime. Not because they're weak, because honesty is exhausting. Real honesty doesn't flatter you. It doesn't protect your self-image. It quietly removes every excuse until only truth remains. I've learned that truth rarely arrives with certainty. It arrives with discomfort, with hesitation, with that strange feeling that something inside you has recognized reality before your conscious mind has found the language to describe it. Those moments are impossible to manufacture. They simply appear unexpected, precise, almost unsettling in how obvious they become once they finally surface. Looking back, I realize every major turning point in my life began that way. Not with confidence, with recognition. Recognition that something I'd accepted for years was no longer accurate. Recognition that the version of myself I'd protected had quietly become outdated. Recognition that growth isn't about becoming someone new. It's about allowing someone unnecessary to disappear. That process is never comfortable. You lose certainty before gaining clarity. You lose identity before discovering authenticity. You lose familiar answers before finding better questions. Most people mistake that phase for being lost. I don't anymore. I think it's the closest thing we have to becoming real, because reality isn't built from certainty. It's built from the willingness to keep seeing more than you saw yesterday. And once that willingness becomes part of you, there's no returning to simpler versions of yourself, not because they're wrong, because you've already seen beyond them. And once your mind expands around a deeper truth, it refuses to fit back inside smaller explanations. That's both the gift and the cost of finally learning how to see. The first thing that disappeared wasn't certainty. It was urgency. I stopped feeling the need to arrive at conclusions simply because everyone else seemed uncomfortable waiting for them. There was a time when I believed every unanswered question demanded an immediate response. Every silence needed filling. Every uncertainty needed explaining before it had the chance to grow into something larger than I could control. Now I wonder if control was ever the point. Maybe it was fear wearing a more respectable name. Fear has an incredible talent for disguising itself as logic. It convinces you that you're being careful when you're actually avoiding. It tells you you're protecting your peace when you're really protecting your patterns. It whispers that you're staying realistic when all you're doing is refusing to imagine a different possibility. The strange thing about fear is that it rarely sounds afraid. It sounds reasonable. That's why it survives for so long. I've spent years believing I understood myself because I could explain every decision I made. Looking back, I think I only understood the stories I kept telling myself. There's a difference, a dangerous one. Knowing your explanation isn't the same as knowing your motivation. Most people become experts at describing their actions. Very few become honest enough to discover what actually drives them. The mind is brilliant at creating narratives that protect its own image. We don't lie because we're dishonest. Sometimes we lie because the truth would require rebuilding parts of ourselves we've spent years defending. And rebuilding is exhausting. It asks you to let go of identities that once kept you alive, even when they've stopped helping you grow. I've learned that survival habits don't disappear just because you're finally safe. They linger, they become personality. People call them preferences, standards, ways of being. But underneath, they're often just old fears wearing new clothes. You don't notice it immediately. It reveals itself in ordinary moments. the conversation you avoid without understanding why, the compliment you struggle to believe, the apology you never ask for because admitting fault feels strangely threatening, the opportunity you quietly reject before it has the chance to reject you. Life doesn't expose us through dramatic events, it exposes us through repetition, the same reaction, again and again and again, until eventually you stop asking why life keeps presenting the same lesson and start asking why you keep responding the same way. That's where awareness begins, not when the world changes, when your interpretation of it does. I've started paying attention to the moments that don't make sense, not because confusion frustrates me anymore, because confusion usually appears right before understanding expands. Clarity has a habit of arriving disguised as uncertainty. You think you're losing direction. In reality, you're losing assumptions. Those aren't the same thing. Assumptions create comfort. Truth creates freedom. Comfort and freedom rarely arrive together. That's why so many people choose certainty over growth. Growth has no guarantee, only possibility. Possibility sounds beautiful until you're the one responsible for choosing it. Choice is heavy, not because making decisions is difficult, because every decision quietly becomes a version of yourself that can never exist again. Every yes creates thousands of invisible no's. Every path walked erases countless others before they ever have the chance to become real. People think regret comes from choosing incorrectly. I think regret often comes from choosing unconsciously, living by habit instead of intention, repeating inherited beliefs because questioning them feels disrespectful, building a life that looks complete from the outside while quietly feeling unfamiliar from within. I've seen people succeed at lives they never actually wanted. It's heartbreaking, not because they failed, because they achieved the wrong dream perfectly. No one warns you that's possible. Everyone teaches you how to climb. Very few ask whether the ladder is leaning against the right wall. Maybe that's why achievement sometimes feels strangely empty. Not because success lacks meaning, because meaning can't be borrowed. You have to discover it personally. No one can hand it to you, not parents, not teachers, not the people who genuinely love you. They can offer direction. They can't provide purpose. Purpose has to be recognized from within. Recognition, there's that word again. It keeps returning. I've begun to think recognition is more powerful than discovery. Discovery suggests something didn't exist before. Recognition admits it was always there. You simply weren't ready to see it. How many truths spend years waiting for our awareness to catch up? How many answers stand directly in front of us while our expectations keep us looking somewhere else? It's strange how often the mind overlooks what doesn't match the story it's already telling itself. We're not blind because reality is hidden. We're blind because familiarity edits what we notice. You don't see the entire world, neither do I. We see the version our minds have practiced seeing. That's both fascinating and terrifying, because it means two people can witness the exact same moment and walk away carrying entirely different realities. Not because either one is lying, because perception is selective, attention is selective, mirror itself is selective. The stories we tell about our lives aren't objective history. They're edited collections of moments our minds decided were important. What gets left out? What beautiful things have we forgotten simply because pain demanded more attention? What strengths have we ignored because insecurity spoke louder? The mind isn't a camera, it's an author, always rewriting, always rearranging, always searching for consistency, even when consistency comes at the expense of truth. That's why changing your life begins by changing the story you believe about yourself, not inventing a better story, removing the inaccurate one. There's a quiet freedom in admitting, I don't actually know if that's true anymore. Those words create space, space for curiosity, space for growth, space for becoming someone who isn't imprisoned by yesterday's conclusions. I've become suspicious of certainty, not because certainty is always wrong, because absolute certainty often closes the door before understanding has finished entering. The people who know everything rarely learn anything. Learning requires humility. Humility requires admitting that reality will always be larger than your current understanding of it. I find that comforting. It means I'll never reach the end. There will always be another perspective waiting beyond the one I'm standing in, another layer beneath the one I just uncovered, another question hidden inside the answer I thought would satisfy me. Life isn't a puzzle to complete. It's a conversation that keeps deepening. The moment you think you've heard everything, it whispers something you've never considered before, and if you're quiet enough, patient enough, honest enough, you hear it, not as noise, as recognition, the kind that doesn't ask for applause, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply settles into your mind until one day you realize you've become someone who sees the world differently than you did before. No dramatic transformation, no defining moment, just thousands of invisible shifts quietly arranging themselves into a person you never planned to become. And somehow, that version of you feels more familiar than the one you spent years trying to protect, as though your truest self was never something you had to create, only someone you had to stop hiding from.